In the summer of 1764, 260 years ago today, over 24 Native nations gathered to meet representatives of the British Crown at Fort Niagara in present-day Youngstown, New York. They were there to discuss the practical terms of the Royal Proclamation issued by the Crown in October 1763 and to extend the covenant chain relationship to the Native nations of the Western Great Lakes. The meeting was an international summit, part of an effort to establish peace in the wake of a protracted war with France and a still simmering campaign by a confederacy of Native nations to drive Europeans from native homelands. Niagara was one of the largest and most consequential of many diplomatic meetings held during the 18th century, and it still resonates today. My name is Charles Pryor, and along with Joy Porter, I lead the multi-year research project Brightening the Covenant Chain that explores the diplomatic relationship between the Crown and the Haudenosaunee. This project is funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council of the United Kingdom. In this podcast, I discuss the Treaty of Niagara with John Borrows, professor and Loveland Chair in Indigenous Law at the University of Toronto, and Mark Walters, professor of law at Queen's University at Kingston. Both John and Mark have written extensively on the Royal Proclamation, the Treaty of Niagara, and their place in historic and contemporary understandings of Indigenous law in Canada. I hope you enjoy the conversation. John, I'm wondering if you could sort of lead us off by just providing an overview of what was the Treaty of Niagara.
Yeah, it's a series of agreements that took place in the summer of 1764 as First Nations gathered with the Crown to be able to discuss what the relationship would be in North America after the French had been defeated at the Plains of Abraham. And so the Treaty of Niagara was an opportunity to bring legal traditions into conversation with one another about how people would continue to live with one another, given the change that occurred in the European relationships in North America.
And it's preceded by the Royal Proclamation, which appears in October of 1763. It's published as a single broadside. The proclamation appears after a fairly hectic summer where imperial officials in London are working on various drafts of a plan, and where back in North America, there's a sort of a sweeping conflict. So to what extent is Niagara an attempt at providing the ultimate peace?
Yeah, so the British were turning people back from Montreal, which is where they used to gather to have these yearly commercial and diplomatic exchanges with the French. And in turning people back from Montreal, in inviting them to Niagara, it was to say, as the Royal Proclamation says, that the lands that you're living on, we're not going to be disturbing them, molesting you on those lands, and that we'll continue to trade with you, but that trade will be such that there's not going to be this abuse and there's not going to be this French influence anymore. And so the Royal Proclamation and talking about reserving the lands to the Indians and creating patterns of trade that were more favorable to the British is what then is part of the milieu at the time as the Niagara meeting is coming into focus.
Mark, you've written about that meeting and its size and the nations who attended it. It's held at the old Fort Niagara, as it's called. It's a former French fort that the British take. It's not in Niagara on the lake. It's not a honeymoon destination. It's in Youngstown, New York, just to get that straight. But if you were there at that meeting, what would you see?
Right. Well, I think it would be quite a remarkable sight for us today, but probably for people at the time as well. The record suggests that there were over 2,000 representatives from various Indigenous communities from all around the Great Lakes, and beyond as well. Some traveled a great distance. So invitations had been sent out earlier in the spring. to allow representatives to travel, and some traveled a great distance. So I can imagine it would have been a striking picture to see so many Indigenous peoples from different communities and traditions gathered. The treaty relationship between the British Crown and certain Indigenous communities, especially the Haudenosaunee, had been strong and long for a period of time, beginning in the mid-17th century. But many of these communities had not had a long treaty relationship, or maybe not at all, with the Crown, because they had been allied with the French until the previous few years. And so this was an opportunity for the Crown to establish or put on a firmer foundation a treaty relationship with nations from that massive territory around the Great Lakes, the upper country around the Great Lakes, that had previously been, for the most part, under the sway of the French.
And so it's an international, multinational summit, in effect, isn't it? And its purpose is to take the Royal Proclamation, which has made its way around the Great Lakes, beyond the territorial limits of the British, which are not very extensive anyway. And it is taken out, and the core ideas within the proclamation are introduced in the context of that large treaty council. And then an agreement is reached at the end of that council. And the council is led by, mainly, I suppose, is Sir William Johnson, who's the British Superintendent of Indian Affairs, but also Molly Brant is present and very influential there. So, and it's one of many, I suppose, treaty councils that take place between the British and the native peoples of North America, starting from the 17th century forward. Why is this one different?
I think it's different, and for two reasons at least. I think the first one is simply, as I mentioned, the significance of bringing into the covenant chain treaty relationship as it was or had become known, especially Anishinaabe communities that had previously been aligned with the French. And in the year or 18 months previous, there had been significant hostilities, and a number of the British forts had been under siege from warriors from communities concerned about the intentions of the British upon the departure of the French. So this was an opportunity, as John said earlier, to reassure nations that the Crown was not intending to seize territories, and that this proclamation that had been issued the previous year was an explicit statement from the Crown as to that effect. So I think that's the significance. Just the size of the gathering. In many respects, these treaty councils aren't one-off things. They're part of a process. The covenant chain needs to be polished, as they said, every year at least. It's a relationship, not a moment. It's and so Niagara punctuates that relationship. It's something that is significant, but it goes on afterwards, and it carried on before.
John, you wrote or published in 1997 a chapter which is really a point of reference for a lot of this, called, the first part of the title is Wampum at Niagara. And it's an essay that foregrounds Native power. It begins at the premise that Native nations were very clear that they had never been conquered, and they were never under the sovereignty of any power but themselves. And then it goes on to argue that really, when we look at the Royal Proclamation, we need to look at the Treaty of Niagara as well, and you see them as a pairing. I'm wondering if you could just sort of tease that out a little bit and explain why we should see them as a pair.
Yeah, I think part of this is then to understand what the nature of law is in this context, which it can't just be something that's imposed or exported from England, and that we would expect that all of the interpretive principles would then have to align with that origin, because Indigenous peoples in North America also had law. They had ways of making decisions, and the principles that were related to those processes, which gave authority, gave guidance to, gave bindingness to their relations. And so the significance of this meeting, seeing both the document of the Royal Proclamation and the Treaty of Niagara treaties that were there in that 1764 period, is to say that we have to interpret this in a what Mark has written about in a subsequent place, in an intersocietal way, a sui generis way, a unique way. Can't just use the common law itself. Even Sir William Johnson recognized in 1765 we can't just use the common law to understand these relations. And so why we want to see Native perspectives and power and agency and law in this context is because the treaty, the agreement there, the Royal Proclamation there, has to be understood in light of the varied parties' understandings at the time that they were gathered at the moment of these forces intersecting with one another.
And that, I guess, goes to the word, the very word treaty, because when you say treaty, I think most people would know what they think a treaty would be, which is a fairly formal looking document on an oversized piece of paper with a bunch of seals on it. And we do see those in the record. The Fort Stanwix deed looks exactly like that. But for Native nations, what did treaty mean?
Yeah, so those documents are evidence of an agreement, but they're not the complete record, because people were speaking in their Indigenous languages, and they were using pipes, and they were passing wampum strings. And I would say that they were also bringing their own worldviews to these agreements. And so treaties mean the intersecting nature of that multi-juridical, trans-systemic engagement between the parties. And so to just look at the document alone is to impoverish our view of what was being grappled with as people were coming to agreement around peace and trade and justice, and working out the relations of the parties in that area.
So in the Niagara context, you place in the essay a main focus of sort of a main device for understanding this relationship is the two-row wampum that presents us with two parallel paths or rivers, one each with its own respective vessel, the respective vessels representing Native nations on the one hand and European powers on the other. And these rivers or pathways run in parallel but never intersect. How do we understand those ideas in the record, in the archival record?
So you see these covenant chain belts being referencing the linking of arms together. And so there's obviously the two-ness of that linking together, and there's a separate nature to our bodies as we're joined in that way, but we do join at the elbows. And so like that two-row wampum, there's a separateness to that, but there's a joining of that too, in peace and friendship and respect. So in the record, what you find is the discussions of friendship and of peace and of the promises of mutual aid and linking together, even as there's this respect for the differences that are there between the parties. And part of that respect for those differences is that Sir William Johnson transacted the agreements with the different parties that came over those 2 months. And so, the meetings with the Mississauga would have been different from the meetings with the Seneca, would have been different from the people coming from Michilimackinac. And so there's a respect for that distinctiveness. But even as there's a respect for that distinctiveness, there's also an attempt to join together through the arms being linked, the covenant chain, the promises that talked about as being binding on one another in that regard.
Mark, there's a famous quote from Johnson. It appears just about everywhere anybody writes about this meeting, and I think he's writing to Thomas Gage, and he says that we must tie them down or bind them according to the forms that they find most agreeable, or words to this effect. Effectively, what he's saying is that they need to have a wampum belt ready. And his correspondence around this period is filled with discussion of where wampum can be acquired and how much it costs, and they have it made. So, in terms of Johnson's own sort of approach to all of this, he's very much operating in a set of customs and practices of diplomacy that are not European at all. They have no resemblance whatsoever. To what extent, Mark, is it true that British diplomats were drawn into a set of customs and practices and languages and gift giving and protocols, and that they were obliged to operate within those systems in order to be successful and to achieve even a bit of what they wanted?
Right. Well, I think it's true. Yes, they were. And Sir William Johnson is an example of a British official who understood that. He's a complicated character in many ways, controversial character, but at least in terms of his handling of the forms of the treaty relationship, he's explicit in stating, as you mentioned, the importance of treating with communities by their own customs and rules. And he says that over and over again. And it's interesting. Sometimes he refers to these customs as their customs or rules, and then sometimes he refers to them as our customary rules. And this is slipping back and forth between two ways of thinking. And in effect, the Indigenous customs for treaty formation had become cross-cultural customs as well. And I guess a good example of that would be the opening of treaty councils with the performance of the ceremony of condolence to set the stage, to provide the basis for rational and peaceful deliberation. One following, as John said earlier, this concept of respect. So there's unity, almost, well, from the Indigenous perspective, it would appear a spiritual unity, but between peoples who respect the equal freedom of the communities involved. So it's a complex relationship in that way, but formed from the perspective of a version, at least, of Indigenous law.
So, John, what happens then in your essay? You deal with the sort of the afterlife, if you like, of Niagara and the Royal Proclamation, and how they're sort of interpreted and construed. Later on, they are referred to, the Royal Proclamation is referred to as a treaty. It's referred to something that is akin to law. It is referred to as a charter. So how do these documents then figure in the Canadian case? Because, of course, following the American Revolution, things take a radically different direction there. But in the case of what's north of the Great Lakes, how do these documents figure in what happens next?
Yeah, so the documents do require that native land be recognized as being in Indigenous people's possession, and it cannot be settled upon by people coming without first receiving the permission of the First Nations through agreement. And so the document is really important because it influences how English governance, Canadian governance, respects and interacts with those prior land interests. And it's also the case that Indigenous peoples remember the agreement at Niagara because, as Mark said, it's a part of an ongoing process. Every year they would have gathered for the exchange of presents and the renewal of that relationship. And so on the Indigenous side, people are gathering each year and talking about what their relationships are with one another and with the Crown. And on the Canadian side, as it were, they're forestalling and preventing settlement of land unless it's in compliance with what was in the proclamation.
And that precedent has at least figured fairly recently at Tynedega, the Culbertson Tract. The argument there was that was a land transaction that wasn't done in public, and the proclamation stipulated public land transactions. So that was sort of upheld. But in a broader sense, where do these documents and the parallel traditions, I guess the sort of the legal pluralism that we find in these treaty councils, where does this sit in Canadian law, and what is the attitude of the Canadian courts to these forms at the moment?
So the courts use canons of construction to be able to interpret these treaties. And because they are written English and really only record one side often of the exchange, they say that these treaties have to be given a large, liberal, and generous interpretation, resolving ambiguities in favor of the Indians, looking at them as the Indians would naturally understand them, just as a counsel to inoculate ourselves against only seeing these agreements from one legal perspective and one worldview. And so the courts have talked about these through these canons, and the larger context is that Indigenous peoples across the country continue to articulate ways that their laws were there at the time of European arrival, survived that assertion of sovereignty, and continue to have relevance for their relations with one another and then with the Crown. And in places where treaties were not entered into, like in British Columbia, there's still an attempt to find Indigenous law as interlocutor, as a partner with the Crown in creating relationships. And so on Haida Gwaii recently, there's something called the Haida Rising Tides Agreement, where Haida title is recognized. At the same time, fee simple title is recognized on Haida Gwaii, and it's done by both using Haida law and provincial law. And so the mutual recognition agreement, they don't call it a treaty. They're quite explicit to say it's not a treaty, but it's an example of two legal systems recognizing one another's legal relations to land and territory in that area.
How would you characterize the difference? I mean, many people think they know what the law is when they hear about it. They imagine a lot of sort of heavily bound volumes sitting on the shelves of law professors' offices, for example. It's a written thing. It has its canon of interpreters, particularly in the English tradition, the common law. It has its court. It has its courts, its bodies of precedent, its accrual of cases. What does Indigenous law look like next to that? Where is it found?
Yeah, so law is a human activity, and that human activity of lawing takes different forms in different societies. So, there's Islamic legal tradition that is different from what you've just described, and a Jewish legal tradition that also has its own distinctiveness. And we also, amongst Indigenous peoples, this human activity is to find through principles and processes ways that we can regulate our affairs and resolve our disputes. And so within Indigenous law, you find standards and principles, criteria, authority, measures, signposts, guideposts, indicia, landmarks for guiding this decision-making, this dispute resolution, this regulatory function. And it would be different in the Mi'kmaq, from the Haudenosaunee, from the Niska, but they all have these patterns of decision-making that don't necessarily always have a written form with an executive, a legislature, and a judiciary. But nevertheless, humans can't just live with free-for-alls. We need some expectations about what's in bounds and out of bounds, and to be able to argue about what those bounds are when there's disagreement. And so with Indigenous law, it's drawing on our creation stories, it's drawing on analogies from the natural world, it's drawing on our deliberative traditions, it's taking up our positivistic proclamation traditions, our chronicles of do this and don't do that. It's also in our customary ways of interacting, the implied expectations about how one would be in those communities. And those, of course, are now intermingling with written sources like bylaws or statutes or, tribal courts or dispute resolution bodies. But they're nevertheless not just something that you can boil down to statutes, legislation, judicial decisions. They are coming from another source that requires an appreciation of these other ways of law being practiced or other ways of lawing.
And you're both teach, Mark, you're looking forward to returning to the classroom in a few short weeks and busy putting syllabi together. And there are a number of new appointments in First Nations law at major universities. It's a major growing field, I suppose. So, Mark, I wonder if you could say just a little bit about some of the challenges of teaching law in this context within a law school setting. I mean, how do you go about it?
Sure. I think the first thing to recognize is the landscape is changing quickly and has been for some time. So, when John and I were law students at about the same time many years ago, law schools didn't teach Indigenous law, or at least it was patchy at best. And indeed, the courts were not really attuned to the importance of Indigenous law either. So the times have changed a lot. And I think the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report of 2015 has made a big difference on this front. Call number 28 requires that law schools teach Aboriginal law, the Canadian law of Aboriginal rights, and also something about Indigenous legal traditions to all law students. And so all law schools are grappling with this challenge. Some are further ahead than others. I think one of the biggest challenges for people like me, non-Indigenous law professors, is just how we approach this topic in a respectful manner, understanding that while it's important that we talk about Indigenous law, it's also important that we recognize the limits of our capacity to address laws that really emanate, as John has just eloquently described, from communities that are very different from non-Indigenous common law, civilian traditions, the European legal traditions that have dominated law schools in Canada. So it's a work in progress, I'd say. How to do that well is a real challenge. And I don't know that I certainly don't have the answer to how it all works out. But I think the key is to approach the task with a real sense of humility and respect for difference, and to ensure that there's room for Indigenous voices to come through in no matter what the format for teaching is, so that students, Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, can hear those voices and make out for themselves what they believe is important for the task of reconciliation, which is central to really, I believe that reconciliation is a legal principle, a constitutional principle. It's one that we all need to know about if we're to understand our constitutional order in a proper manner today.
And I'll ask John to sort of wrap us up if he doesn't mind. And I guess the question I have that sort of builds upon Mark's response is, what next in terms of the relationship between the First Nations of Canada and the Canadian government and also the provincial governments? And there's been a real tension there. And John, you've written about that. But what is next in terms of how the law will form part of reconciliation, form part of addressing the welter of issues that face First Nations communities where there's great disparity in terms of wealth and social conditions across the country? What role does the law have to play? Because those that turned up to Niagara in the summer of 1764 had absolute faith in the ability to come together and form agreements that would bind everybody and would create a sort of a future that would provide for future generations. And are we close to that, recapturing that part of Niagara?
As we've talked about, law always requires renewal. It's never one and done. The need to have processes that have us continue to sit down with one another is what was at Niagara and what is required now and into the future. In other words, law still is a human activity. It's something that we should do and not just have done to us. And so to the extent that we can widen those circles of participation, not only using Indigenous law in the various ways we've described, but also to see the common law be reinvigorated and to recognize that it too came out of a context with lots of different legal cultures, Saxon and Anglo and Jute and Norman and Frank, and with a variety of different courts, ecclesiastical and borough and maritime and common pleas and king's courts and ecclesiastical courts, right? The common law itself came out of a very rich and dynamic cultural context that had a lot of different influences in it. And the common law has become more uniform, and yet it still retains that possibility of being open to and receptive of the places that it came from. So what next is to see the common law as being more porous than we might sometimes imagine, seeing our democracy as being more participatory than sometimes we feel is practiced, and of course seeing Indigenous law as being a part of this process that is about participation and is about finding the ongoing ways of regulating our affairs and resolving our disputes by doing something that has patterned principles and processes as a part of it.
I think that's an absolutely fascinating insight. And I think it would require a whole new conversation to talk about this idea of the porousness of the common law. But maybe we'll do that, but we'll have to leave it there. I've been talking to John Borrows of the University of Toronto and Mark Walters of Queen's University. Gentlemen, thank you for your time.